It was October 12th, 1960, the kind of night that felt routine, forgettable, the kind people lived through without ever knowing history had quietly shifted. Danielle Porter, 25 years old, had just finished her evening art class at the community college. She wasn't a troublemaker. She wasn't the type who drifted into bad company. She was the kind of person who made others softer just by being near them. Kind, creative, always quick to laugh even when her own life wasn't easy. For her parents, Harold and Ruth Porter, Danielle was their promise that things would get better, that the next generation would live a little freer than the one before. That night, she packed her brushes, zipped her coat, and began her short walk home through the quiet streets of Rochester. It was barely a mile, the same route she'd taken dozens of times. But this time she didn't make it back. Her mother later said she remembered hearing a siren around 9 p.m., then silence so thick it felt unnatural. At first, no one panicked. Danielle was responsible. She'd call if something came up. But an hour passed, then two. Her father drove through every block between the school and their house, headlights cutting through the damp night. No trace. Just her satchel near the curb by St. Mary's Avenue. Open, sketchbook torn, pencils scattered like the aftermath of a struggle no one had witnessed. By morning, news spread across Rochester. The girl everyone knew had simply vanished. At first, no one in Rochester wanted to accept that Danielle Porter was gone. People said things like, "She probably missed the last bus," or "Maybe she stayed with a friend overnight." Denial was easier than the truth. This was a small, trust-built town, the kind where doors were left unlocked and neighbors borrowed sugar without asking. Danielle wasn't supposed to vanish here. Bad things didn't happen in their quiet corner of New York. At least, that's what they told themselves. By the third day, the police began searching the nearby gorge and surrounding fields. Reporters hovered, but the town stayed defensive, as if admitting Danielle was missing meant accepting that safety itself was an illusion. Every streetlight flicker became a warning. Every shadow, a question. People began escorting their children to school. Men who once nodded politely on sidewalks were now eyed with suspicion. The world that had always felt familiar turned into something cold and unrecognizable. Danielle's parents barely slept. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone as if willing it to ring, while her father walked the riverbanks until dawn, calling her name into the dark. For days, volunteers searched fields and alleyways, carrying flashlights and quiet dread. They found nothing. Just that same open road, the one Danielle had walked so many times, mocking everyone who'd ever said, "She'll be fine." No one said it out loud, but something broke in Rochester that autumn. A silence that used to feel peaceful now felt heavy. People stopped letting their kids walk home alone. They avoided eye contact in grocery lines. Trust, the one thing this town had always taken for granted, was gone. That October night didn't just take Danielle, it took Rochester's innocence. How well do you really know the streets you walk every night? She was 5 minutes from home and never made it. Subscribe now, because not every neighborhood is as safe as it looks. Detective Alonzo Holt had been on the force for 16 years when the Porter case landed on his desk. A quiet man with a reputation for persistence, Holt was the kind of detective who believed every case could be solved with enough hours and heart. But Danielle's disappearance would test both. He arrived at the Porter home 3 days after she vanished. Ruth Porter greeted him at the door, eyes swollen from crying, voice hollow from repeating the same sentence. "My daughter wouldn't just disappear." Holt believed her. Most cases started with uncertainty, but this one began with conviction. Something had happened to Danielle, and it wasn't by choice. The first days brought a flood of volunteers and witness statements. A neighbor claimed to have seen a dark-colored sedan idling near the corner around the time Danielle left class. Another said they saw a man in a brown coat following a woman along the street. The details shifted with each telling. The car became blue, the coat turned gray. The truth blurred under the noise of fear and rumor. Holt took notes, confident he could sort it out. But by the second week, he realized how little he actually had. The city offered support, briefly. Reporters filled the front lawn, cameras flashing each time Ruth stepped outside. "Missing girl mystery deepens," one headline read. "Police chase new lead," said another. Yet behind the optimism, Holt knew they were losing time. With no body, no suspect, and no witnesses who agreed on anything, the case began to slip through his fingers. By December, the volunteer searches had stopped. The papers moved on. But Holt stayed, combing through reports late into the night under the buzz of fluorescent lights. He retraced routes, questioned teachers, and interviewed classmates again, including a young man named Tobias Rourke. Tobias had been in Danielle's art class and often offered to carry her supplies home. When questioned, he said he'd walked part of the way with her that night before splitting off toward Main Street. He seemed nervous but cooperative. Still, something about his timeline didn't sit right. Holt logged Tobias as a person of interest. Weeks later, he added another name, Dominic Leone, Danielle's ex-boyfriend. Dominic had a reputation around town for his temper, and though they'd broken up months before her disappearance, some believed he hadn't taken it well. Holt interviewed him twice. Dominic swore he hadn't seen Danielle in weeks, but his eyes darted whenever her name came up, as if remembering something he wished he hadn't. Holt didn't have enough evidence to hold either man. He hated that word. Enough. It became the shadow that followed every move he made. By early 1961, the Porter investigation had gone from tragedy to spectacle. The headlines that once begged for justice now questioned competence. Where is Danielle? Became Is Rochester safe? And finally, has police failed the Porters? The city's patience thinned, and with it, Holt's credibility. He found himself caught between a grieving family and a department desperate to move on. Every press conference felt like theater. The same answers, the same empty promises, the same sinking truth. They were no closer than the day she vanished. Holt's superiors demanded visible progress. He reopened Tobias Rourke's file, searching for inconsistencies, but the young man had already moved away to Buffalo. Dominic Leone, meanwhile, had gotten engaged, building a new life as though the past had been erased. Holt tried to track down witnesses from the original night, but half had changed their stories, and the other half had forgotten the details. The human memory, he realized, wasn't an archive, it was a storm, erasing what didn't fit. The town, too, began to fracture. Parents warned daughters not to walk alone. Shop owners closed early. Church sermons filled with talk of sin, punishment, and divine justice. Fear replaced curiosity. People stopped asking what happened to Danielle and started asking what she might have done to invite trouble. For Ruth and Harold Porter, it was betrayal layered over heartbreak. Their daughter wasn't just gone, she was being rewritten by strangers who never knew her. Ruth's faith collapsed quietly. She stopped attending church, stopped opening curtains, stopped answering the door. Harold, who had once been known for his optimism, started drinking heavily, first to sleep, then to forget. The community that once surrounded them drifted away, unable to face their pain or the reflection of their own helplessness. Detective Holt kept working, long after others stopped. He believed he owed it to the Porters, to Danielle. But as winter turned to spring, his phone stopped ringing. No new tips, no new leads. Only a single case file on his desk, full of pages that said nothing useful. On the one-year anniversary of her disappearance, he visited the Porters' home. Ruth didn't open the door, Harold did, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Harold said, "You told us you'd find her." Holt wanted to promise he still would, but he couldn't bring himself to lie. A week later, the department reassigned him. The Porter file was marked inactive. Holt boxed the evidence himself, labeling it neatly, Case 6041, Missing Female, Danielle Porter. When he locked it in storage, the echo of the metal door closing felt final, like a coffin. That night, he went home and sat in the dark until morning. For the first time in 16 years, Detective Alonzo Holt didn't believe in closure. The search ended, but the silence began. Would you still fight for answers when everyone else stops listening? As the 60s turned to 70s, Danielle Porter's name became a whisper. Not in the police station, not in the newspapers, but in the mouths of children telling stories after dark. They called her the girl by the gorge, a warning tale, a shadow that parents used to keep their kids close. What began as grief became folklore, and with every retelling, truth slipped further from memory. Some said she ran away. Others said she was taken by a stranger who vanished into the woods. The file sat locked away in the evidence room, untouched, unremembered, collecting dust and indifference. Detective Alonzo Holt retired in 1973. By then his hair had grayed, his eyes dulled, and his spirit fractured. He'd spent years chasing ghosts in his head, unable to stop replaying every lead that went cold. On quiet nights, he'd drive past the same street where Danielle disappeared, headlights cutting through fog, hoping to feel something, a clue, a sign, anything that said his failure wasn't forever. But nothing ever changed. Rochester had moved on. He never did. When he died in 1988, his wife said the case file was the last thing he touched. The Porters didn't live to see the turn of the century. Ruth passed first. Her obituary only mentioned her as the mother of the missing. Harold followed 2 years later, found in his recliner with a half-finished letter addressed to the police department. It began with 3 words, "Please remember her." The letter was never sent. It was found wedged between couch cushions, yellowed and torn, like the memory of the girl they loved. Time turned the tragedy into something convenient, distant, diluted, and safe to talk about again. Rochester grew. Malls replaced the meadows. The gorge was fenced off, and the town's younger generation knew Danielle only as a myth. Don't walk the ridge after dark, parents warned. That's where the Porter girl vanished. Her story was now caution, not crime. In the local diner, an old man sometimes brought up the case between cups of black coffee. "They never found her," he'd say, shaking his head. "Whole town looked. Nothing." New residents would lean in, half interested, half skeptical, and ask, "When was that?" He'd pause, trying to remember, then shrug. "A long time ago." Even the dates were fading now. By 2018, 60 years had passed. The world had changed. But Danielle's absence still lingered, quietly haunting the cracks of her hometown. For most, she was a story from another lifetime. For one person, she was a mystery worth rewriting. By 2019, the Rochester Police Department was full of new faces, new systems, and technology Holt could never have imagined. Cold cases were rarely reopened unless something miraculous surfaced, DNA, a confession, or political pressure. But sometimes one person's curiosity could resurrect the past. Detective Anya Solis wasn't from Rochester. She transferred from Buffalo after leading a successful homicide closure that gained statewide attention. What drew her to this quiet town wasn't the promotion. It was her fascination with forgotten names. She believed the past never stayed buried. It simply waited for someone stubborn enough to care again. While reviewing archived cases for digital conversion, she stumbled upon the Porter file. The handwriting was faint, the pages brittle. Inside were photos, grainy black and whites of Danielle smiling by a sketch easel, her parents at a vigil, and one haunting image of an empty road lit by a street lamp. The final note read, "No further leads, file inactive." Anya stared at that line for a long time. She'd seen hundreds of cold case reports before, but this one felt unfinished, not forgotten, just paused. That night, she looked up Danielle's name online. Only 2 results appeared: a scanned newspaper clipping from 1960 and a small-town message board thread titled, "Whatever Happened to the Porter Girl?" The comments were short and speculative, some mocking, others wistful. One caught her attention. "My grandfather said they never checked the quarry. He always thought that's where she was left." Anya bookmarked it. She wasn't superstitious, but she believed in patterns. And in her gut, this case still had one. The next morning, she requested access to the old evidence storage. The clerk hesitated. The files hadn't been touched in decades. Some were falling apart, others misplaced. When they finally retrieved box number 1960P, a thin layer of dust rose like smoke. Inside were a few personal belongings: Danielle's wallet, one torn notebook, a scarf, and a small paper bag labeled "Sample Soil Residue, Original Site." Anya examined the items carefully. The soil bag had never been fully analyzed. Handwritten notes suggested it came from near the gorge, though records didn't specify where exactly. She sent it to the new forensic lab for testing, requesting advanced trace material analysis. "Old dirt, new science," she told the technician with a faint smile. At home, she read through the interviews again. Tobias Rourke, Dominic Leone, and a few locals whose statements contradicted each other. One comment from Holt's notes stood out. Subject described a man in a tan truck near the corner, dismissed as unreliable. Back then it might have been nothing, but 6 decades later, data and DNA had rewritten what unreliable meant. For the next few weeks, Anya obsessed over the case. Her colleagues teased her for chasing ghosts. But she didn't care. To her, this wasn't about reopening a file. It was about giving back what was taken from a family who never got to bury their daughter. When the lab results came back, the technician called her personally. "You're not going to believe this," he said. Traces of synthetic lubricant used in machinery and automotive repair were found in the soil sample. More importantly, they discovered degraded biological material still preserved in the fibers of Danielle's scarf. It was faint but recoverable. For the first time in 60 years, Danielle Porter's case wasn't cold anymore. He lived among them for 60 years. If time can hide evil that long, what's hiding near you? Subscribe before the truth passes you by. Detective Anya Solis had seen miracles before. Cases revived through chance DNA hits or unexpected confessions. But this felt different. This wasn't luck. This was persistence meeting time head-on. When she reopened Danielle Porter's file officially in January 2020, it didn't stir celebration. It stirred discomfort. Some of the older officers, children of men who once worked the original case, questioned why she was wasting resources on a ghost. Her answer was simple: because her story isn't over. The old evidence slides were brittle, almost transparent with age. The coat fibers, stored in fragile envelopes, were labeled with smudged ink. The nail scrapings were sealed but discolored. Solis handled everything as if it were sacred. She sent the materials to the state's Advanced Forensics Unit in Albany with a single directive: analyze everything, twice. Weeks passed in silence. Solis buried herself in routine cases while the past waited in refrigerated drawers and microscopes. But one late March afternoon, her phone rang. The forensics director's tone was steady, careful, the kind used when good news carries weight. "We found something," he said. Solis froze mid-step. "A partial male DNA profile. It's weak, but it's viable enough to compare." Her heart pounded. After 60 years, Danielle Porter had left behind proof of her struggle. The fragments extracted from the nail scrapings belonged to someone who fought back, someone who left part of themselves behind. The lab also re-examined the tiny prick mark on Danielle's preserved clothing photo and accompanying medical notes. Using modern digital enhancement and chemical residue analysis on a remaining fiber thread, they confirmed the presence of a sedative compound, a barbiturate used in the 1950s for medical and industrial purposes. Solis leaned back in her chair as the report came through. Danielle hadn't just been attacked, she'd been subdued. Whoever took her knew what they were doing. That night, Solis stayed in the office long after everyone left. The file was open on her desk, the black and white image of Danielle's smiling face beside columns of chemical data. It was heartbreaking, science speaking for a girl who never got the chance to. Solis whispered under her breath, "You fought hard. Now we fight with you." The next morning, she contacted the genealogy unit, providing the partial male DNA profile. "Run it through everything," she said. "I don't care how far back it goes." It was a long shot. Most cold case DNA from that era degraded beyond recognition. But with modern database cross-matching, even fragments could tell a story. For weeks, the results hovered in limbo. Solis visited the gorge where Danielle disappeared. The path had changed, repaved, developed, but the stillness remained. She placed a single blue flower by the fence, a color Danielle was known to love from her old art notebooks. "We're almost there," she murmured. Back at the lab, a match flickered into view. Not a direct hit, but a familial one. The profile shared markers with a living male in Ohio, identified through public genealogy databases. The name, Rourke, Tobias Rourke, the same classmate interviewed 60 years ago. The blood in Solis's veins went cold. She reopened Holt's original notes, the section where Tobias was described as cooperative, emotional, and helpful in organizing volunteer searches. He had moved to Buffalo shortly after the investigation collapsed. Now, his distant nephew's DNA had just tied back to Danielle Porter. For the first time in decades, the case wasn't theory, it was momentum. Solis closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled, whispering, "She's speaking." When the genealogical results came through, they drew a narrow, chilling conclusion. Two men, brothers, both born and raised in Rochester, Dorian and Victor Kroll. The names meant nothing at first glance, but buried in the town archives, those surnames appeared dozens of times. Property records, civic donations, and company reports. The Kroll family had quietly shaped Rochester's economy for decades. Detective Anya Solis began her background check at dawn. Dorian Kroll was 84, a retired pharmaceutical technician who'd once overseen quality control at a now-defunct factory north of town. His younger brother Victor, age 81, had been a school teacher for 40 years. Beloved, respected, and publicly honored. Both had spotless criminal records. No arrests. No history of violence. The initial instinct was disbelief. Two elderly men, both viewed as moral pillars in their community, couldn't possibly connect to a 60-year-old murder. But the DNA didn't lie. And Solis had learned long ago that evil doesn't always age like guilt. Sometimes it just hides in plain sight, learning to smile better over time. Through historical employment records, she discovered Dorian's factory once manufactured sedative compounds, barbiturates, the same chemical found in the residue on Danielle's scarf fibers. That connection alone was enough to shift focus. The factory, North River Pharmaceuticals, had gone bankrupt in the late 70s after reports of contamination and lost permits. Dorian, however, had left with an unblemished reputation. Solis contacted the lab once again. "I need cross-check confirmation. Compare the fiber residue from Danielle's clothing with textile samples from that facility's archived inventory," she said. The technician hesitated. The factory had closed before most of the lab team was born, but agreed. Days passed. When the call came, it was quiet but decisive. "Detective," the tech said, "we found identical fiber structure. Same composition, same manufacturer. Your sample matches the industrial coat material issued to employees at the time." Solis leaned back in her chair. The pieces were locking together. Dorian had the access, the chemical expertise, and the proximity. Victor, the teacher, had the public trust and had stayed in town long after his brother quietly retired and moved upstate. The brothers had lived entire lives shadowed by something they likely assumed time would erase. The next day, Solis drove to Victor Kroll's small house near the edge of town. Wind chimes hung from his porch, and his front yard was littered with bird feeders. He answered the door wearing a cardigan, his smile polite but thin. "Detective, how can I help you?" "We're reviewing historical cases," she said evenly. "May I ask if you remember a woman named Danielle Porter?" Victor blinked, once, twice. His eyes darted away just a moment too long. "Of course," he replied. "Terrible story. Everyone in town remembers the Porter girl." His tone was casual, but his hand trembled as he gripped the doorframe. Solis noticed. "Your brother worked at North River Pharmaceuticals, correct?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Yes, long time ago." "Why? Do you recall if he ever mentioned working with any barbiturate compounds?" The faintest smile appeared, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Detective," he said softly, "that was half a century ago. Everyone worked with something back then. Chemicals, machines, even memories." It wasn't a denial, it was a warning. Solis left the house uneasy, the kind of unease that told her she was close, dangerously close. She called the team to arrange discreet surveillance on both brothers. Within a week, Dorian was seen leaving a small clinic in Buffalo, coughing heavily, his gait slow. Victor was seen visiting him twice, always alone, always after dark. Meanwhile, the lab results confirmed the partial DNA profile from Danielle's nails matched a Y chromosome inheritance line consistent with both Kroll brothers. But the deeper trace on the scar, the one that carried chemical residue and partial touch DNA, leaned 98.3% toward Dorian. There it was. The link science had waited 60 years to reveal. The report hit Solis like a physical weight. She stared at Dorian's photo, an old man with clouded eyes, hands folded neatly, smiling faintly for a driver's license renewal. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like the type of man who'd been invited to church fundraisers, trusted by parents, and remembered for his generosity. But in the quiet, Solis whispered to herself, he didn't change who he was. The world just forgot to look. What if your favorite neighbor wasn't who you thought they were? It was just after 6:10 a.m. when the quiet of a Rochester cul-de-sac broke under the hum of unmarked police cars. The winter air was brittle, pale sunlight barely touching the snow-crusted roofs. Inside one of those homes, 84-year-old Dorian Kroll was sitting at his kitchen table, his trembling hands wrapped around a mug of tea. He didn't see the convoy approach. He didn't hear the car doors open. He only looked up when the soft knock came. "Mr. Kroll," a voice said, firm but calm, "this is the Rochester Police Department. We have a warrant for your arrest." He froze, not like a man confused, but like someone who knew this moment would come. When the officers entered, Dorian didn't resist. His first words weren't denials. They were quiet, almost rehearsed. "It took you long enough." Detective Solis, standing in the doorway, felt her stomach turn. This wasn't defiance, it was acceptance. The kind that comes from years of living with a truth you've convinced yourself no one will ever uncover. In the garage, officers found what decades of rumor and false leads had buried: a silver locket, tarnished but intact. Inside it was a faded photo of Danielle Porter, folded carefully as though preserved, not discarded. It was the same image used on her missing person posters in 1960. Dust covered everything around it: jars of screws, paint cans, old factory tools. But the locket sat clean, untouched, preserved. The discovery stopped the search team cold. That locket had been a birthday gift from Danielle's parents just 2 weeks before she vanished. It had her initials engraved inside, DP. The officers didn't say a word. They just stared. When the evidence was logged, Solis stood over the item table and whispered to herself, "You kept her close all this time." There was no comfort in finding it, only confirmation of horror. Meanwhile, media trucks began to flood the narrow street. Neighbors peered from windows, cameras flickered, and whispers turned into disbelief. People who had known Kroll for years, decades even, refused to believe it. "He was kind," one church member said through tears. "He donated to the children's choir. He helped shovel driveways. He couldn't hurt anyone." But he had. And now, for the first time, the town that once pitied Danielle's disappearance had to face the truth that the man who'd bowed his head in every vigil, who'd spoken words of comfort to her grieving parents, had been her killer all along. In the police station, Dorian sat through processing like a ghost of himself. When asked if he understood the charges, he nodded. "I understand," he said softly. "You're just 60 years late." During interrogation, Dorian didn't raise his voice once. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't cry. Detective Solis placed the silver locket on the table between them. "This belonged to Danielle," she said. He stared at it for a long moment before whispering, "She dropped it. I thought maybe someone would come looking if I kept it safe." Solis leaned forward. "You kept it safe for 60 years? His lip quivered. "You don't understand. Back then, nobody would have believed it was an accident. She was scared. I was just trying to calm her down." The transcript would later record those words exactly as they were spoken. Not a confession of intent, but one of guilt through memory. He admitted he'd known Danielle from the community center, where she'd volunteered teaching art classes. He said she'd trusted him, and that trust had turned to panic when she threatened to tell someone about his behavior. "She wouldn't stop yelling," he murmured, his voice fading. "So I gave her something to make her quiet, just for a while." That something, the sedative identified in her scarf decades later, had been the last thing she ever felt. Solis sat silently, every muscle in her body tense. She wanted to shout, to accuse, to remind him of the life he'd stolen. But she didn't. The case had waited 60 years. It could endure a few more minutes of his quiet unraveling. When the recording ended, Dorian looked directly at her. "You know," he said, his voice almost calm, "I prayed beside her mother every year. She thought I was grieving with her. Maybe I was." That sentence would echo through every courtroom, every headline, every church conversation for the months that followed. By noon, the arrest had spread across national media. Octogenarian arrested in 1960 murder flashed across screens, alongside images of an old man in handcuffs. Reporters swarmed the police steps as Captain Reyes held a press conference, stating, "Thanks to DNA innovation and relentless determination, we've delivered justice for Danielle Porter. No crime, no matter how cold, will stay hidden forever." Inside the community, reactions were raw and divided. Those who'd known Dorian as a friend felt sick. Others felt vindicated, whispering about how he'd always seemed too good, too polished, too present. At St. Martha's Church, where every anniversary vigil for Danielle had been held since 1961, candles flickered beside her framed photo once again. Only this time, the light burned not in remembrance, but in fury. "I let him hold my child when she was a baby," one woman told a reporter, trembling. "All those years, he walked free while we prayed for justice. How do you forgive something like that?" You don't, and that was the truth of Rochester's reckoning. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a confession of collective blindness, a reminder that evil rarely announces itself. It learns to blend in, to attain alongside kindness, to become part of the background. That night, Sola stood outside the station under a steady snowfall. Her breath misted in the cold air. For the first time, she felt something close to peace. Not satisfaction, not relief, but quiet acknowledgement. She whispered toward the sky, "She can rest now." The snow kept falling, soaked and endless, blanketing the street where Kroll had been taken hours earlier. He smiled at every vigil. Subscribe, because the next smile could be hiding something too. By the time Dorian Kroll faced trial, he was a shell of the man the town once knew. The courtroom lights reflected off his pale skin, his trembling hands folded neatly on the defense table. He looked harmless, like someone's grandfather, but everyone in that room knew better. The frailty of his body didn't soften the weight of what he'd done. If anything, it made it heavier. Time had aged him, but it hadn't erased what he took. Detective Anya Solis sat just rows behind the prosecution. Months of preparation led to this moment. She'd testified in dozens of trials, but none like this. This wasn't just about evidence. It was about history, community, and the haunting echo of a girl whose story had been muted for 6 decades. When the proceedings began, the room felt suffocating. The prosecution opened with one quiet sentence: "Justice delayed is still justice served." They presented the DNA evidence, the recovered locket, the fiber matches, and most devastating of all, the confession Kroll gave without emotion. Clips of his interrogation played on the large screen, his voice shaking slightly as he said, "She was scared. I only wanted her quiet." You could hear the gasp ripple through the courtroom. Not because of what he said, but how he said it. Calm, distant, empty. Kroll's attorney tried to argue age, health, and remorse. He called his client a dying man haunted by a terrible mistake. But the prosecution cut through that narrative effortlessly. "He's not dying because of his guilt," they countered. "He's dying because life gave him more years than he deserved." When Detective Solis took the stand, the courtroom stilled. She spoke plainly, no theatrics, no rehearsed sentiment. "Science doesn't forget," she said, her voice steady. "For decades, we thought Danielle Porter's story was buried. It wasn't. It was waiting. DNA gave her a voice again, and that voice led us here." That single line would later appear on every newspaper and evening broadcast. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed nonstop. Reporters called it the case that outlived its century. But inside Rochester, the story wasn't about headlines. It was about heartbreak. Those who had known Danielle's parents, most now gone, had passed their grief like an inheritance. The younger generation, raised hearing only fragments of "The Girl by the Gorge," now watched as justice finally arrived. The town gathered at the old church where her memorials were still held every October. Candles lined the pews again, but this time the air felt lighter. Less haunted, more resolved. One elderly woman, a former classmate of Danielle's, spoke at the service. Her voice trembled as she said, "He didn't just take her. He took our sense of safety. Every time we told our children to be careful, it was her face we remembered. And now, after all this time, we can finally say she was heard. When the verdict came, guilty of second-degree murder, Kroll didn't react. He just lowered his head, his thin frame collapsing into the chair. The judge's words were deliberate. This court finds no expiration on truth. The sentence, life imprisonment without parole. At his imam, it was effectively a death sentence, but no one pitied him. Even his former church members, once vocal in their disbelief, stayed silent. They'd come to the courthouse dressed in black, not in mourning for him, but for the decades lost to silence. After the sentencing, Detective Solis stood at the courthouse steps, addressing the crowd of reporters and townspeople gathered outside. She didn't deliver a speech. She simply said, "We don't get to choose when truth comes back, but when it does, we have to listen." That night, as the news played across every major network, Rochester felt something it hadn't in 60 years. Stillness without fear. The town finally stopped whispering about the girl by the gorge and started saying her name out loud again. Danielle Porter. For the first time, her name wasn't a story, it was closure. Dorian Kroll died quietly in his cell 8 months later. There was no obituary, no vigil, no words of farewell. The only note found in his belongings contained 3 words written shakily across lined paper. I saw her face, but his end didn't matter. What mattered was what followed. The Porter family's foundation for missing persons, dormant for decades, was revived by a local youth group in Danielle's honor. Every October, a memorial walk was held in her name, ending at the gorge, now marked with a plaque that read, "She was never truly gone. We just hadn't learned how to listen." And as Detective Solis looked out over that quiet riverbank during the first memorial after the trial, she understood something deeply human. Justice doesn't erase grief. It doesn't bring peace overnight, but it breathes life back into the silenced. She turned to one of the younger officers beside her and said softly, "The gavel didn't close her story. It finally let it breathe. When justice finally speaks, does it heal or just remind?" Spring arrived early that year. The snow that had blanketed Rochester during the trial melted into soft trails of water that ran down the streets, carrying with it the remnants of a season that had held too much sorrow. Yet amid that quiet thaw, something remarkable began to grow. The Danielle Porter Memorial Scholarship Fund opened officially on April 10th, 2024, 64 years to the day since she disappeared. Funded through community donations, it supported young women pursuing degrees in forensic science and criminal justice. Detective Anya Solis was the keynote speaker at the inaugural ceremony, standing before a packed auditorium filled with students, families, and local leaders. She didn't start with statistics or success stories. She started with silence. For years, she said, her voice low but steady, Danielle Porter was just a name in an old file, a photograph fading in a drawer. But that name mattered. It mattered to her parents, to this community, and to every detective who refused to let time win. Today, we make sure it keeps mattering. The audience rose in applause, not the kind born of celebration, but the kind that carries reverence. People cried openly. For the first time, Danielle's name wasn't whispered in mourning, it was spoken with pride. That night, local news covered the event with one simple headline: From Silence to Legacy, Rochester honors Danielle Porter. Every October, when the leaves began to turn amber and the air filled with that faint chill of early autumn, the town gathered at Genesee Gorge, the place that had become synonymous with both tragedy and remembrance. Lanterns lined the riverbank, each one carrying a name written in black ink. Some belonged to missing persons still awaiting justice, others to victims long remembered. At the center of it all stood Danielle's memorial stone, newly restored and framed by flowers. Detective Solis, now heading the state's cold case division, stood quietly with a candle in hand. Reporters called her the woman who gave time a conscience, but tonight she wasn't a detective. She was just another person paying tribute to a girl who should have grown old, but never got the chance. A young girl no older than 15 approached the podium. She was the first recipient of the scholarship fund. Her hands shook as she unfolded a small piece of paper and began to read. "I never knew Danielle." "Yeah," she said softly. But because of her, I want to work in forensic science. I want to make sure no one ever has to wait 60 years for justice again." The crowd went silent. Even the river seemed to pause its flow. Then one by one, the lanterns were released into the water. Hundreds of them, drifting gently downstream, their reflections trembling across the surface. From the bridge above, the light spread like memory itself, flickering, unstoppable. In the months following the trial, Detective Solis received a state award for excellence in cold case investigation. But when she was asked to deliver an acceptance speech, she surprised the audience by talking not about science, but about patience. "Justice isn't quick," she said. "It's faithful. It waits for those who are willing to keep listening, even when everyone else has stopped." Her words would echo beyond the room. The phrase, "justice isn't quick, but it's faithful," would be engraved later beneath Danielle's memorial plaque. It became a message, not just to law enforcement, but to every parent who'd ever felt forgotten, every family who'd been told to move on, and every person who believed that truth has no expiration date. Solis often returned to the gorge alone after that, not as a detective, not as a public figure, but as someone who carried the weight of a story that had reshaped her understanding of justice. She'd sit on the old wooden bench overlooking the river and whisper quietly to the wind, "We heard you, Danielle. We finally heard you." The sound of the water always answered, not in words, but in the soft, unending rhythm of remembrance. Rochester changed after that case. The town that once turned away from tragedy began confronting it head-on. Cold case units expanded. Volunteers joined advocacy groups. A local law was even passed requiring unsolved homicide files to be reviewed every 5 years. The city's history, once marked by silence, now held something stronger: accountability. Local students began organizing truth walks each spring, retracing Danielle's last known path through the old downtown streets. They'd carry blue ribbons tied around their fists, the same color as the dress she wore that night. Elderly residents watched from porches, nodding quietly, knowing the story had finally become more than pain. It had become purpose. At City Hall, a mural of Danielle now covered an entire wall, painted by local artists. It wasn't somber, it was radiant. She was smiling, looking upward, her eyes full of the life that time couldn't erase. Beneath it read one line, in white paint against a blue background. "In a city of thousands, one young woman refused to be forgotten. And because she held on, so did justice." The mural became a pilgrimage site for visitors, school trips, and survivors' families. Flowers were always at its base, fresh, bright, alive. And as dusk fell each evening, the street lights near City Hall cast a faint shimmer across her face, as though even the light had chosen to remember. In the end, it wasn't the courtroom that defined Danielle Porter's story. It was the endurance of truth. A truth that crossed generations, outlasted denial, and reminded everyone watching that time can't kill what refuses to fade. Detective Solis once said that every case she took afterward began with the same weird ritual. She'd place her hand on the file and say Danielle's name before opening it. It wasn't superstition, it was respect. Because somewhere between the silence and the science, one girl's story became a vow to never stop listening. In a city of thousands, one young woman refused to be forgotten. And because she held on, so did justice.